Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Stacey Koprince. I'm a GMAT, GRE, and EA instructor with Manhattan Prep, and I also serve as the head of content and curriculum, which makes all the study materials that our students use.
Hey, everybody. My name is Ryan Jacobs. I'm a Manhattan Prep GMAT and EA instructor of 15 years, and I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, super excited. I always love talking to Ryan. I always love talking about the GMAT. So it's like, perfect serendipity to be having this conversation. This is the second in a series that we're doing about basically how to set up your prep, the major things to pay attention to think about, to make sure that you're doing as you get going on your prep. The first session is linked down in the description of this session if you're watching this later, so you can go back and watch the first one. And today we're going to be focused on, we're calling it non-math on the official GMAT. There's a quant section, there's a verbal section, and there's a data insight section. Quant and verbal are self-explanatory. Data insights actually mixes both quant and verbal. So when you do that section, you'll see on the official test that all the questions are classified as either math-based or non-math-based. So we called this non-math as opposed to verbal studies, just to get the point across that we're talking about anything that's non-math-based skills, which actually covers both the verbal and the data insight sections. It's not just the verbal section today. So just a quick recap from last time, and then we're going to dive into the discussion. We talked about major phases of study last time. There are 3 major phases. Your initial study is when you're learning everything for the first time, all the stuff, all the question types, all the facts and rules that you need to know, how to do everything, strategies, all that stuff. Once you learn everything for the first time, you move into what we call review and improve cycles. So this is where you are like, everything technically, but you're not great at everything yet. And so you're taking practice exams or doing practice problems, identifying gaps and holes, and then going and improving those things, and then taking more exams to see how you're lifting your score. And then the final week is just your final game plan for peaking on test day, for having a great day on test day. So if any of that intrigues you, definitely go back and take a look at the first session that we did. We also talked about executive mindset, which is how you're going to manage the decision-making and especially time management during the test. Super important. And then I have one new thing right now, which is discount codes. So we have some exclusive discount codes for you that are good today only. We've got there's 4 different codes. I think Abhijit's going to add them to the comment box. So there's GMAT 100 for $100 off of our on-demand products. There's GMAT 250 for $250 off the regular live course. There's GMAT 500 for $500 off of our 655 plus score guaranteed course. And then GMAT 700 for $700 off of our 10-hour plus tutoring packages. So use those. If you were thinking about buying, definitely use those. I'll repeat them again at the end of the session. All right, housekeeping over. Let's do this, Ryan. So what does it mean to study for non-math questions? What are we doing here? We're going to cover arguments, which can show up in critical reasoning in 2 parts most commonly. Ryan, anything that you want to tease?
Oh, man. I think we call them arguments, but it's not really like arguing in real life, where you have an adversary. I think of it more of a cooperative activity. And I think that's part of the key to really having the right mindset for those questions. But that's my teaser. I'm sure we'll talk more about that later.
We will get there. So we're going to, for arguments, we're going to cover the 3 bullet points that you see on the screen. And then we're also going to talk about what I call information overload questions. This is most commonly reading comp and multi-source reasoning, where they give you like this big pool of information, and then you have to go answer multiple questions about that information. Although really you could have information overload on any question on this test. And then again, we'll talk about kind of what are the major things that you need to do here. And between those 2, the arguments and information overload, that's pretty much covering 90% of what I'm going to call the non-math question types on the test. Yeah, there are some different things here and there that you can sometimes get, but if you can master these 2 things, that's going to take you a decent way along the path that you need for the non-math side of the test, in my opinion. Ryan, I'm curious what you think.
Yeah. Information overload is a real thing. And it's I think an important thing to remember about all this information we're getting is that we only have to remember it for 6 minutes. So sometimes I think, people will take all these notes because that's what we used to do in college. But that's because we had to remember it for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or on the final. And I think, for me, a lot of learning the GMAT is learning how to deal with this short-term memory task. And how to adjust what we've been trained to do our whole lives and really think about information overload for this specific purpose.
That's such a great point. I love that you made that point. That's such a great point. Yeah, on this test, any question that's sitting in front of you, this question's only going to be in front of you for a few minutes. Ideally, you actually don't want this question to be in front of you for 5 or 6 minutes, because that would mean that you're messing up your timing for the rest of the section. So yeah, it's a very different ask and a very different task than when you're in school, or even if you're at work and you're getting information overload. Yeah. All right, so there's a little teasing about what's about to come. So let's dive into these arguments. And the first issue here is just, what is an argument? What are they really doing with arguments on the GMAT? These are super common, as I mentioned, on critical reasoning and two-part questions. They do occasionally show up on reading comprehension and MSR questions. They could technically show up elsewhere, but these are really the places that you're most likely on the test to see arguments pop up. So the first thing we want to talk about, I love this picture. Ryan picked out this picture, and this is an awesome picture, Ryan. I specifically love the bananas on the shirt of the top.
I know. Awesome. Look at his little pajamas.
Why did you pick this picture?
So this is one of my favorite quotes about critical reasoning I've ever heard. It was actually another colleague of mine said, critical reasoning is a test of listening skills. And I thought that was a great way to say it, especially because, a lot of times I'll see students be struggling with a question, and they'll say, well, I thought the answer was A when actually the right answer is B, but I just don't get why A is wrong. What did I do wrong? And then we'll start talking about it, and I'll say, well, what do you remember the argument being? And I start to realize that what they've read and what they've understood the argument to say was not actually what the argument said. And so their answer is right according to what they heard, right? It's just that they've misheard something in the beginning, and that caused them to make the mistake. And so I think, it's important right up front with critical reasoning to realize the task isn't just the answering the question. The task is actually reading the argument and listening very carefully to the limits of it, right? What is the other person arguing, and what are they not arguing? What are the limits of what they're trying to, to argue, or the limits of their conclusion? And that's really the first step. So it's a test of listening skills. And if you can be a good listener, a lot of times people who have been called good listeners in their life tends to do better on critical reasoning because they naturally have that skill. And at the same time, I think it's something that can be trained and should be trained. So.
It's so interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking, but it's interesting that you called it listening as opposed to reading, because of course this isn't happening out loud, but I think I understand now. You're viewing that, like, you see a person who's making this argument. This argument isn't just some text on some like robotic text on a screen or something like that, right? So yeah. There's this person who you can't see, but is behind the argument. They're making this argument. You're listening to them make this argument.
Yeah,
and then
absolutely.
Earlier you mentioned, and then there's this collaborative thing going on. So what's going on with this person who's making the argument?
Yeah. There's some sort of compassion that has to happen, right? Like if you can treat it like an actual person's experience, that also helps you sort of come up with things that are relevant to the argument, because then you feel like it's a more real life situation, which of course, that's what we want. That's part of what we're being asked to do.
Love it. And when you and I were chatting last week, because of course we didn't exactly practice the podcast, everybody, but we were looking at the slides and deciding what we wanted to say. And Ryan said to me that one of the things he likes to pretend, and this really stuck with me, Ryan, was that the argument is being made by a coworker who's got there's this big presentation coming up, and the coworker's like, "Hey, can I run something by you? Here's what I want to say. Can you help me make it better?"
Yeah. Like, we do this all the time at work. We're collaborating with people. And if you feel like this is your colleague and they have an argument and it's almost there, but you got to give it to the boss and you're part of the team, right? You want to help them make it better. And so that's the mindset that I like to go in with.
Yeah. So you are picking apart the argument. You are being critical, right? So you are trying to find the holes, the flaws, the assumptions, the whatever. But you're turning that into, okay, how can that particular flaw be addressed in order to make the argument better? If you can understand an argument at that level, then you have cracked that argument. Any question that they ask you about the argument, they might ask you to find the assumption or to strengthen or weaken it, or to describe the role that a particular part of the argument is playing. If you've really cracked the argument to the point that you can say, okay, well, these two things are flaws and here's how you'd fix them, you can answer any question about any argument on the test. All right, here's our second one.
Ooh, debate skills.
Again, excellent picture choice. And this kind of, I think, flows in from what we were talking about here. I really like, Ryan, your idea that it's a collaborative thing. It's not combative. So like a debate is it's not an argument. It's got boundaries. It's got like, okay, this is what we're doing and we're all having this conversation, but in service of having a bigger discussion. You're trying to help your coworker, but the best way to help your coworker really is to critically analyze that argument. It really is to pick it apart and find the flaws and figure out how to make it better.
Yeah. And the thing I like about debate too is that it really is about the logic. It's not about how loudly you're yelling. Debate to me implies there's this structure to it where I have an argument, I have my conclusion of the argument, right? The logical endpoint, but I need to back that up with facts. And if those facts don't lead logically to the end, right? If there are any holes in that, that's what debate is about, is that I need to point that out. And I need to say, just because this is true doesn't mean that this is certain to happen. Why not? Well, what else could happen? What are the other alternatives? People who do debates all the time, they're always thinking with that mindset. And so this is kind of the worlds that I like to live in, right? Is that we're debating using facts and logic. That's what this question type is about. And
the other thing that you're making me think too, I remember being in high school and like being in debate class, and there's all these rules you have to follow and whatever when you're debating. And one of the biggest things is that you really do have to stick to the boundaries or the parameters of the argument that you've been given. You can't take it outside of that. That's not going to win you any points in the debate, and it's not going to win you any points on the GMAT either. So they're going to give a pretty narrow argument with a pretty narrow conclusion. And part of your task as you train yourself to get ready for the test really is, I got to stick to that little, box that they gave me. That's where I'm playing for this argument.
Yeah. Actually, since there's a great question in the chat, I think this is the time to address it. Someone asked, hey, I have an exam on Thursday. Any tips you can give me? Well, if it's about critical reasoning, I can actually give you one tip, which is for most of critical reasoning, I don't know if I'm spoiling this or if we might talk about this later too. But for most of critical reasoning, I think you want to pick the answer choice that has the biggest impact on the conclusion. So if you read an argument and then you see an answer choice that would change your mind about whether the conclusion of that argument is sound, that's the answer choice that you want to pick, right? This is debate. It's about what's the conclusion? Where are we going with all of this? If you can change my mind about that, you've got an answer.
And in particular, I'd add to that, if you're down to two answer choices, it's often the case on verbal that there's one or two, maybe even three answer choices that you can get rid of pretty quickly. But then it's those last two or three answer choices that are really the hard decision to make. So if you're stuck between two answer choices in an argument-based problem, I would go exactly with what Ryan said. What makes the biggest difference to the conclusion of that argument? That's the tie break. The other thing I'll add, by the way, in general, taking us out of the current discussion, but time management. Yeah. The single biggest thing that you can do is not let yourself spend like 4+ minutes on any single question. Every question is worth the same amount. So if you spend a bunch of time on one question, all you're doing is hurting yourself, because then you're going to have to rush on other questions and you're going to start making mistakes. So you got to be really disciplined about just being like, oh, look, I've got, 21 or 20 or 23 things that just got dropped into my inbox. I've only got 45 minutes to do these things that just got dropped into my inbox. I can't take one of them and give it a bunch of extra time. I'm going to have to prioritize. So that's the other thing, is just avoid being stubborn and getting stuck on something. All right. What do we got next? All right, we're going to get into a little bit more nitty gritty on arguments. This first one says know the argument types. So every argument is asking us, every argument is associated with a particular question. And that question is asking you to do a certain kind of analysis. And I teased this a little bit earlier when I said, like, they could ask you to find an assumption. They could ask you to strengthen the argument. So there's a limited number of these questions that they'll ask, and each one is asking for a different kind of mental analysis to do in order to come up with that answer. So you need to know what those types are before you go into the test. And you need to know how to recognize when one of those types has been put in front of you. And that's actually the first bit of the next set of bullet points here, which is when a new argument pops up on the screen, whether it's critical reasoning or two-part or wherever it might show up. As soon as you recognize that an argument is going on, which you will by the like wall of text that's on the screen, and by the answer choices that are for two parts, they'll be full sentences as opposed to like numbers or something like that. The very first step immediately is to identify the kind of question type they've just given you for this argument. And Ryan, how do you think about identifying the question type?
There's sort of families of question types that, even, for example, a strengthen the argument question and a weaken the argument question. I think of those as being in the same family, because you have a conclusion and something that strengthens it would be something that gets rid of the thing that weakens it, right? So as long as you can spot that gap in the argument, then the only real issue you need to deal with is, well, don't go in the wrong direction, right? Don't weaken when they ask you to strengthen, don't strengthen when they ask you to weaken. But most of the process stays the same. And so when I think about identifying the question type, that's really what I'm trying to do, is say, what framework am I applying to this one? I will say also there's one question type that I find really, really different from the rest of critical reasoning, which is when they ask you to draw a conclusion or make an inference. Because that's the one type of question where you shouldn't expect the full argument to be up top, right? You shouldn't expect the problem to give you all the premises and the conclusion. They'll just give you premises for that one, and it's your job to pick the conclusion. And so because that requires me to read very differently than the other question types, I consider that a separate family of questions. So, this takes some practice. It takes some amount of just seeing a bunch of different question types. I find it, though, not as daunting a task when you get into doing some of the practice as it might seem at first. So that's kind of my mindset there.
I love it. And I'm really glad you brought up inference questions. Inference is the single most common question. I'm going to just assert this and you tell me if you agree or disagree, Ryan. Inference is the single most common thing that this test asks you to do. And I would argue that literally every single question is asking you to make at least one inference. And that actually is not just the nonverbal stuff, that's the math stuff too. So like a super simple example is if I tell you that x plus y equals 5, and then I tell you that x is 2, then you can infer that y is 3. That's an inference. All an inference is like you gave me some evidence, you gave me some givens, and then I was able to conclude something that must be true from the evidence that you gave me. It works the same way on verbal. It's just not quite as clear cut as the math example that I just gave, but it's still that same idea. Whenever they're asking you to infer anywhere on the test, and they ask you on every single question type at some point to infer, it's really, okay, they've given me some baseline information. They've given me some givens. What can I say? What can I conclude has to be true from that information? Ryan, did I go too far in saying that I think inference is in basically everywhere on the test?
I think that's fair. Yeah. I mean, the GMAT loves to tell you things in indirect wording. Your math example was great. The one I always think of is when they say stuff like, I bought a book for $20 and I sold it for $24. Immediately, okay, you made a $4 profit, right? But as a GMAT teacher, that's always what I'm thinking, is they're saying it this way, but they're really telling me the profit. You find that all over the place on this test.
Mm-hmm. And all those little inferences add up to actually being able to get you to the correct answer. So one of the things you'll definitely be training on as you get ready for this test is, what is it like? What makes a good inference? They're also going to try to trap you with that by wording things, as Ryan said, in sort of indirect ways that can that can lead you astray, that can lead you essentially to make an inference that's not correct. It goes backwards. I just did a problem, Ryan, this weekend. I'm trying to think if I can say this in a way that's not too confusing, because it was a really hard problem. It was basically talking about something that happened like 20 months ago and then 8 months ago or something like that. And the way that it was worded, when they went and asked the question, they were talking about the time from when the first thing happened 20 months ago to the second thing that happened 8 months ago. So that would be 12 months. Did I just do that math right? But it would be really easy to be like, oh, it's 8 months ago that we care about, to basically reverse, because they kept going back and forth from counting from today versus counting from in the past.
Yeah. Chronological confusion.
Exactly.
You'll see that a lot on critical reasoning.
Yeah, exactly. And for any of that kind of stuff, it's super important to be using your scratch paper. My scratch paper saves me all the time. If I don't write it down, I'm going to probably mess it up. But if I keep track of it on my scratch paper, I'm a lot more likely to be able to map out and keep track of the different bits of information in the different directions that it's going, and then save myself from falling into a trap. That actually takes us to our second bullet here under the consistent process, which is deconstruct the argument. So I know that they're asking me to strengthen, let's say. Now I have to go actually read and understand that argument. And if I know before I start reading that argument, the kind of analysis that they're asking me to do, that sets me up to be already thinking about the argument, to be critiquing the argument, if you will. So this would be the equivalent, for your analogy, Ryan, of like, you've come to me and said, hey, I'm putting together this presentation. Can you take a look at it? And can you tell me how to strengthen it? And so now as I'm listening to your argument, I'm already thinking, okay, how can I strengthen this? Or if you told me, hey, I want you to tell me where the weak points are, I'd be thinking, okay, where can I weaken this, as I go through and I'm deconstructing the argument. Anything to add to that, Ryan?
Yeah. One thing with deconstructing the argument is you're trying to, this is the listening skills part. I'll put it that way, right? When you're deconstructing, you're not just pointing at things and saying, yes, this is the premise and this is the conclusion and this is just some background information. It's not just about categorizing and getting it down on your scratch paper. It's really about you're processing it through your brain, organizing the information, and then writing it on your scratch paper in a way that your brain has processed it. So this is all by way of trying to understand what the argument is. There's a great question in chat. How do I get faster in the verbal section?
I was eyeing that too. I was like, talk about that.
Yeah. I'll tell you kind of what I'm thinking here, since it's relevant to what we're talking about. I find that a lot of times, I'll talk about critical reasoning first, and then later on we'll talk about reading comprehension. But for critical reasoning, I find people who are spending a lot of time, usually when I look at where they're spending their time, it's looking at the 5 answer choices. And I hear this a lot in class, where it takes me so long because these answer choices are so long and they're so detailed and they're so hard to read. To which my response is, well, maybe the key is actually to slow down in the earlier steps, right? Because if you can read and deconstruct an argument and you can understand what the holes in that argument are, right, which is this step that we're talking about, then later on, when you get to the answer choices, you'll be able to look at A, B, and C and just say, those are all wrong. They have nothing to do with the conclusion of the argument. And then you can just spend your time really deciding between 2 instead of 5 answers. And so I know it's a frustrating feeling when it's like, oh God, this takes me so long. But maybe where you're focusing on trying to study and improve that, by looking at the answer choices and saying, let me read these faster, maybe we would be better served by deconstructing the argument a little more carefully and with a little more thought.
Yeah. And I'll add that can be even more so on 2-part questions, because 2-part questions will sometimes have 6 answer choices, not even just 5. So the work that you do up front can absolutely help you to get rid of answer choices faster once you get to that stage. I want to say something too. Let me hit the 3rd bullet point here, but I want to say something too about that part of it. So the state the goal is a really short step, but it's a crucial step. It's remind yourself what you're doing. Like, what did they ask me to do here? Before I go look at those answer choices, what kind of thing am I looking for in the correct answer? And what kinds of things might show up in trap answers for whatever this question type is? For the wrong answer, that last step, I want to build on something that Ryan just said. So Ryan, you talked about being able to eliminate some answers more quickly. On all verbal based or, non-math based questions, so in DI or in the verbal section, the way that I think about going through the answer choices is I actually go through the answer choices twice, which doesn't sound like it would save time. It sounds like that would take more time, but it saves time because this is what I'm doing. And I want to know what you think about this, Ryan. The first time I go through the answer choices, I am not trying to decide what's right. I'm just deciding what's wrong, and that I know it's wrong, and I'm never going to look at it again. So I'm literally just narrowing down to the things that I want to consider more carefully. And if I've done the upfront work that Ryan just talked about, it's often the case that I'm down to 2 or maybe 3 answer choices after that first pass. And then what that means is I do go through my second pass and look at those more carefully, but I'm not doing that on all 5 or all 6 answer choices. I'm limiting the number of choices that I'm really having to think about more carefully. And so that's where I end up picking up time as I go through the answers.
Yeah. And I will just add to that. I am always on verbal questions, at least glancing at all 5 answer choices. I never want to pick one and run with it without even looking at C, D, and E, for example. Just because, you never know. It might be that you've missed one word in the answer choice that you thought was the right one. I've done that where I've tried to strengthen instead of weaken. I missed the word not. This is not, what the author said, and that'll change the answer from right to wrong. So stuff like that, you definitely want to eliminate the wrong ones in addition to picking the correct one.
Yeah. But try that. The other thing I'll say, by the way, Rohan, you're saying that you can't seem to answer more than 19 to 20 questions. A couple of other things to think about too. One could be reading speed. We'll talk about that a little bit more too when we get to the information overload thing. So and reading speed is, it doesn't just mean learn how to read faster. You'll hear that advice a lot where it's like, oh, if you don't have enough time, like learn how to speed read. It's not, that could be an issue for some people, but for more people, the issue is you're trying to learn too much of the information that they gave you. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we get to the information overload section of this, but they're not going to ask you about all of this information. It's not like school where you learned everything and then you actually were tested on all of it. You're only getting tested on a subset of it. So we'll talk about how to deal with that and essentially how to learn less, to pay less attention to the detail the first time that you go through when you've got one of those information overload question types, and that's going to save you time as well. The other thing I'll say though is I think this is universally true for everybody who's ever taken the exam ever. Everybody feels time pressure because it's an adaptive exam. So however well you can do, the exam can just get harder with you and can keep giving you harder stuff. And so pretty much everybody is going to need to guess on at least a couple of questions, especially if a particular section, like in your weaker section, your weakest section of the 3, expect to have to guess on 2 to 3 questions in that section. So then the task becomes, do I want to have a choice over which questions those are? Because if I just let myself run out of time, then I'm not getting to choose. It's just like the last 2 or 3 questions. And those are not the ones that you want to guess on, because chances are those are not the hardest questions that you're seeing through the whole section. By the time you get to the end of the section, the test has honed in pretty well on your difficulty level, on your ability level. So the questions that it's giving you are around the level that you can do, where earlier in the section, it will have given you some that are really outside of your range, both higher and lower, because it's still trying to find your scoring range. So ideally, you retain control over that choice as you go through the section, where when they give you something that's just too hard, you acknowledge it and you purposely let that go faster. You purposely make that one of your fast guesses, so that you do have time to get to the end of the section.
Yeah. I want to just add one thing too. This has nothing to do with verbal specifically. It's actually applies just as well to the math, but there's something interesting in Rohan's question, which is I can't seem to answer more than about 20 questions when you take the verbal section. My response to that is that's fantastic, because the verbal question has 23 questions. So what that means is there are 3 questions that you can't answer. Just skip them. And you're going to do great, because you can miss 3 questions and still get a fantastic score. I think one of the things we forget about the new GMAT is that you're not really skipping them forever. You're just moving them to the end of the test. So look, guess on those three. If that means that you're able to finish right on time, well, great. Those were three questions you probably weren't going to get right anyway, and it's fine. And by the way, if you do finish with a little time left on the clock, that's fantastic too, because then you can just go back to those three. So yeah, if you can get through 20 questions on time, I think that's great. Just skip those other three.
That's a really great point, Ryan, is so identify those three throughout and save them for the end.
Yep.
And then, yeah, exactly as Ryan said, if you still have some time, you can look. But if not, oh, well, those were the three that you would have wanted to let go anyway. Love it. That's awesome. All right. Keep those questions coming. And Ryan, I teed this one up for you.
Oh, yeah, this is my favorite thing to talk about in class. With critical reasoning, I think there's one thing that makes it different from a lot of the other question types on the GMAT. I'd say this applies to the two-part questions that are critical reasoning based, that are verbal based as well. But with critical reasoning, most of what we're trying to do is not something that's actually on the screen, right? So we spend time reading this argument, but then they ask us something like, well, what assumption has been made? By definition, an assumption is something that we haven't said yet, right? It's something that we haven't talked about. But we should have talked about it, right? It should have been discussed in order for the conclusion to hold. We just haven't yet. And I think that's very different from quant, because quant, if I'm stuck, I can just go back and read the problem and be like, oh yeah, I missed this sentence. I need to use that number and, I need to put it here. But with critical reasoning, I can go back and say, well, what was the argument again? But then I need to do this additional step of thinking, well, what else is out there, right? What additional information might be helpful in deciding this? And this is where those sort of listening skills come into play. And also the imagination center of your brain, right? Really building a mental picture of the situation, putting yourself in the situation and saying, what would I do or not do? Or, how might I behave differently than what they're describing in this situation? That's the task. We need to think about things that we haven't talked about yet in order to anticipate what the answer might be. So building that skill is also somewhat hard because you can't just, look at the page again. But this is also where answer explanations can help, and having a consistent process can help, and all the things we talked about. So,
and Ryan, you're also making me think. I do something similar on the quant side of the test. So for me, the verbal side of things, the non-math side of things is the easier thing for my brain. I have to work harder when it comes to the quant side. And on the quant side, when they give you questions that I call wall of text, right? It's a math question, but it's like, here's this huge story. It's like an entire paragraph long. I do that same thing. Instead of the story being about, I don't know, whoever is, building some widget or doing something, I pretend that it's me in the story. And I'm thinking about how does the story play out? What happens next in the story, whatever. I'm driving the train, I'm doing whatever it is that's going on in the story. And that actually helps me to keep track, to think more logically about, okay, what would happen next? What would happen next? Where on those kinds of questions, if I simply approached it as, oh, this story can be turned into some equations and then the equations need to get solved, I'm much more likely to mistranslate or set it up wrong somehow or something and make a mistake and not notice. And of course, the test writers have already studied and they know the common mistakes that people make, and they put those answers into the answer choices. So I wouldn't even know that I'd made the mistake. So that idea of inserting yourself into the story, into the question, making it real, wherever you can find opportunities to do that on the test, it really helps. It also helps, by the way, because you do kind of get bored. You do kind of get fatigued as you're going through these tests. So being able to do that does actually help keep you more interested and invested for the 2 hours and 15 minutes that you're sitting there taking the test. All right. Okay, that's arguments. Let's go take a look at information overload. So the most common here are RC and MSR. So RC in the verbal section, reading comprehension, and multi-source reasoning in the DI section. But really any DI question could be information overload, because it's kind of the part of the point of DI is to give us way more information than we need. And then we have to wade through it to figure out, what to do about it and how to answer the question. So Ryan, your pictures are just awesome here.
Yeah. I will also fully admit, MSR is probably my nemesis on this test. It's a time challenge for me. For those of you who are new to the GMAT, multi-source reasoning is where there are 3 different tabs of information. It's not just all on the screen at the same time. You have to click on this one, and then on this one, and then on this one, and you have to read each one. And one of them might be a table or a graph, and the other 2 might be a wall of text.
It's literally like they took reading comp and they were like, how can we make this harder?
Yeah, exactly. Rude. But my strategy for dealing with that has been to zoom out to the big picture. So, we're looking down from space, big picture point of view. What is this text about? Who's talking to whom? And, you can think of it also like if you're a consultant or you're in a job that requires you to just look at all kinds of documents and, papers and slides or whatever, and you have a meeting in 10 minutes and you have to synthesize it. That's what we're doing here. There's no way you can read it all in detail, but there is a way that maybe you can just come out with the big idea so that you're able to at least talk in the meeting, and not be totally embarrassed. So that's my starting point.
The thing I'll point out here too is for both RC and MSR, you're going to have either 3 or 4 questions. They're giving you way more information than they can ask about in just 3 or 4 questions. So it's known before you ever start reading the passage or the different tabs of the MSR. It's already known that they are giving you more information than they can ask you about, since they're only going to ask you 3 or 4 questions. So the discipline here, this is what I was talking about earlier, is like, I don't want to go too deep. I don't want to learn like everything, because that takes too much time. And then they're not going to ask me about everything. What I want to do is split this into 2 phases, big picture, and then the details. And the big picture, I'm trying to understand 2 things. I'm trying to understand the big picture that Ryan just talked about, just like, what are the main ideas and the main twists and turns here, and the main contrasts. And I'm also trying to just note down on my scratch paper or map out on my scratch paper, like, what are the kinds of information that I have and where can that information be found? So in an RC passage, it's going to be linear. You've got multiple paragraphs and you're noting paragraph by paragraph, not what the actual details are, because it's open book. You can always go look back at the passage and see those details at any time. But you're noting down that, like, paragraph 2 talked about the data for XYZ, while paragraph 3 talked about the conclusions for XYZ, or whatever it might be. And then for MSR, you're doing that tab by tab. So as Ryan said, you can have 2 or 3 tabs of different tabs of information. And you're noting down just what kinds of information are in each tab, in addition to the big picture. And what those maps are going to do for you is, when you get to the details, that's going to help you to really quickly know, like, oh, that was in tab 2, or that was in paragraph 3, or whatever it might be. And then you're going to go back and you're going to actually read that 2 or 3 sentences or that table or that graph a little bit more carefully and understand it enough to answer this question. And so that's how you're saving that time. You're not learning it all up front when you don't know yet what questions you're going to get asked. You're only going back in and learning the detail where you actually need it, because now you see that you actually have that question on screen. And I'm seeing we got another question in the chat. Should we talk about it, Ryan?
Oh, yeah. Good question. So Pooja asks, how many should we practice to master the concept in daily practice? I might have a different answer than Stacey, but I'll tell you what I tell my students in class. I don't actually, I'm not as concerned with how many questions you do. I'm mainly concerned with you're doing it every day or almost every day. So I always tell my students, like, try to make it a habit. If you like to drink tea every morning, do some GMAT problems while you drink tea. Attach it to something that you already do. If you like to go to the gym like 3 or 4 times a week, maybe you go to the gym and then you come home and you do some GMAT practice problems. And I find that if you do that, if you just make it a habit, if you make it part of your daily routine, you're going to be doing enough questions just sort of by default. Also, the answer varies widely. So some students don't need as much practice as others, and that's totally fine. It depends on you. I studied a long time. I studied 4 months for the GMAT, and I really needed it. I'd been out of college for a while, and so that time was really helpful for me. But I've certainly had students who were on a faster timeline than me and have had success. But yeah, what do you think, Stacey?
So first of all, I fully agree with you. Same answer. It's not about It's not about number. I mean, to a certain extent, yes, you have to do a decent number of questions. You can't do like one question a day and expect to make a lot of progress. But I fully agree with you that it's not about the number of daily questions, but that you are doing it most days of the week. I tell my students, I want you to give yourself one day a week completely off, because your brain actually needs the break. If you tire yourself out too much, then your study time is wasted because you're not actually retaining what you're trying to learn. So one day a week, give yourself that break. But the other 5 to 6 days a week, you're doing at least a little bit of study every day. Some of those days you're doing more study. So some of those days you're going to sit down and you're going to do, 2 practice sets of 10 questions each and the review time. I want to talk about that in a second. The review time is really the key part of all of this. And that might be on a day that you're not working or something like that. But on another day where you're working, you're busy, you have a lot of stuff going on, then yes, something like Ryan said, where you're drinking your morning tea or you're doing something and you might only be studying for 15, 20 minutes that day, 30 minutes that day, but you're doing a little bit, you're letting your brain have a chance to recall what you've learned in the past. What you're actually practicing is bringing that memory back up again. And that's the important thing, because that's what you need to do during the real test. During the real test, you won't have literally just studied or looked at, a bunch of stuff. You're having to go back into your brain and go, okay, when I see this, I need this particular memory, I need this particular strategy, whatever. So you're trying to give yourself lots and lots of opportunities to practice recalling and using that information when you need it. And that's where the do something every day habit comes in. And then for RC, yeah, okay, Rohan, great question. I would not read, I do not, I want to know what you think too, Ryan, but I do not read the whole passage the same way.
Yeah,
I'm going to put this up because we're starting to get into now this aspect of it too. So I definitely don't read the passage the same way. When I'm reading the passage for the first time, so this is before I'm getting to the questions, at first I'm paying really careful attention because I know nothing about this passage. So the first couple of sentences, at least possibly the entire first paragraph, I'm reading pretty carefully. I'm trying to understand what's the context, what's the story, what's going on here. As I start to get it, I start to increase my speed and I start to pay attention to, I'm still just looking for bigger picture things. So if I get the basic context of something and then the passage is like, for example, blah, blah, blah. I don't care about that example right now. I've got the big picture. I'm good. Then I'm going to continue that the beginning of the next paragraph, the beginning of the next paragraph, or if it's MSR, the beginning of the next tab, the beginning of the next tab. So when something changes, I'm paying attention. Or if I see certain language cues, like if I see a contrast word, however, okay, I'm paying attention again because they're about to tell me something new. Or if I see on MSR that it flipped from giving me some text to giving me a table or a graph, right? My brain's clued in like, oh, okay, something different's going on here. I'm going to pay attention. But in all of this, it's still in service of 2 things. One is the big picture. I want to understand the big picture right now. And 2 is setting myself up to later do the research when I understand what my questions are, but I'm not actually doing that research yet. Ryan, what do you think here?
Yeah, that's a good answer. And I'm going to add just one thing. I think it's important to remember this is what studying is about as well. And so when you read a passage, if it's the first one you've ever studied on the GMAT, you're not going to get the reading perfect, right? You're just not. You're going to read it and do all the questions, then you're going to go review it. And then you're going to say, oh, I should have read this a little more carefully. Or, oh, I actually didn't need this to read this as carefully as I did. And so for me, it's about those adjustments, right? And I think a lot of people forget to do this during their review. They forget to, they're reviewing the questions, but they forget to go back and review the actual reading, which is really important, right? You want to think about where should I spend my time? For me, I will say, I want to emphasize what Stacey said about the very beginning of the passage feels important for me because that's my anchor, right? Most of the time, they're going to tell you sort of what the passage is about in the first 1 or 2 sentences. And so once I can build that mental picture, then I'm trying to relay everything back to that instead of having it be totally new information all the time. And that helps me maybe read certain parts a little bit faster than others.
Love it. And Pooja, I want to go back to something that you asked about too. I mentioned that how important review is. When you're doing a practice problem or taking a practice test, that moment when you're doing it, you're not actually learning anything at all. What you're doing instead is recalling a bunch of stuff that you learned and then trying to do it. So you're trying to do it in the moment. Where you learn is in the time between the practice problems or between the practice tests, where you are actually diving in and doing the kind of review that Ryan's talking about. You're looking at it and you're figuring out, okay, what went well, what didn't go so well, what do I want to do differently the next time I see something like this? You might also realize, oh, I need to drill a certain skill or a certain strategy or something like that, and I'm going to go do some of that. I think of this as like, think about whatever your favorite sport is. The Winter Olympics are going on right now. What's your favorite sport there, or whatever it might be? Mine is tennis, which is not a Winter Olympic sport, but anyway. And really, when I'm watching the players play a match, they're not learning how to get better right in that moment. It's all happening behind the scenes. It's all happening between the matches, and they're watching the tape of the match with their coach, and they're figuring out like, oh, I need to work on my footwork, and I need to, do whatever I need to do to practice these things to make them better before I have my next match. So most of the work of improvement is not happening while you're doing the practice problems. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. And so they spend more time doing lots of problems, but not enough time actually reviewing and figuring out how to get better from that problem set or that practice test that they just did. All right. Let's go to our next one. We've been talking about this passage map thing a little bit already. So basically, this can happen anywhere, but it's especially important for RC and for MSR when you've got all this information. You're looking for that big picture. You know that you're not going to follow or learn all of the details right now up front because you don't know what all of the questions are yet that you're going to get. And so instead, what you're doing is you're looking to make a little map on your paper. And we're calling it a map on purpose, not notes. Ryan, you said earlier that like this is not like school. So this is not something where you're learning the information now, but the test is 3 weeks from now, and you have to take really detailed notes so that you can read them over again the night before your test.
Yeah. The analogy that I will also be honest, I don't take notes all the time when I do reading comp, but that's personal to me. Some of my students are successful with or without. But what I will say is, if you are a note taker on reading comp, I feel like make sure your notes aren't just copying what's already in the passage. You don't have to do that. The passage will still be there. Make sure your notes have passed through your brain, and then your brain is outputting some sort of interpretation of the passage, right? That's what we want. The point of notes is to really organize the jumble that is in your brain right now and put it on scratch paper so that you have sort of the basic, like Stacey said, map of the passage.
Yeah. And just as a high level example, let's say a passage starts by telling us in the first paragraph that there's some question that people are researching and that there are two theories about, what's the right explanation is for whatever this phenomenon is. And then the second paragraph talks about the first of those theories, and the third paragraph talks about the second of those theories. I'm not trying to note down what are the theories exactly and, what's the evidence for each theory that's in each. But what I do want to note down is, okay, theory 1 is in paragraph 2. And theory 1 is about, I don't know, bees and echolocation. Okay. And they don't have echolocation. What do they have? Whatever their sensor thing is.
Bats.
It's bats with
echolocation.
Ones, right? Thank you. Anyway. And then paragraph 3 is about theory 2. And, that's about, here's 2 words on what that's about. That's a map. It's not notes. I'm not looking to try to answer the detailed questions from what's on my scratch paper. I'm using the map to go find the information back up on my screen. So when I get that question, let's pretend it's bats and not bees and it's echolocation. So when I get that question where they're like the echolocation of bats, blah, 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 I glance at my map and I'm like, oh, that was paragraph 2. That's it. I'm done using my map now. Now I'm back up on the screen and I'm looking, I'm scanning for in paragraph 2 for echolocation and then reading the couple of sentences that I need to answer the question. So really think of it that way, as you're not trying to take notes the way you were used to taking notes in school. What you're doing on your scratch paper is just setting up that map for RC or for MSR to really quickly help you know where to go. But you are definitely going back up to the screen to look at that information in more detail once you see what the question actually is. We talked about question types on the argument-based things. The same thing is true for the RC and MSR type questions. There's certain question types. Inference is really common here. Specific detail type questions. They might also ask you why the author talks about a certain thing, not what they talked about, but why did they bring this up? So there are certain common question types for these information overload questions as well that you want to make sure you know what they are going in and you can recognize when you've got a certain type, because that's, again, going to help you to process the information from the passage or the tabs and then be able to go find that information to answer the question. And that leads us to our third thing here, which is, again, this consistent 4-step process. It's really similar to what we saw for the argument-based ones. There are a couple differences in the middle there because there is so much more information for information overload. Ryan, pick something out of those 4 bullets and tell me, give me wisdom.
Sure. I think finding the source material, that's a big one. I mean, this sort of ties into the research project thing. But remember how critical reasoning we were talking about, the answer a lot of times isn't there on the screen. It's actually something else that you have to think about that we haven't talked about.
Right.
Reading comprehension is often the exact opposite. Reading comprehension, a lot of times they're saying make an inference. And so beginner students will go off on tangents and they'll be like, oh, what could I infer? What else would be true based on all this knowledge that I've gained over my whole life? No, this is a research project. What they're really asking you to do to make an inference is go look in the passage. It says that this geological record was superior because it was continuous. And so the answer is, well, it would be less useful if it had more gaps, right? If it were less continuous. And so they'll change the language, but it's basically what they said in the passage, just sort of, maybe stated in a negative or whatever, but we're looking for where it says that. Right.
Yeah,
and so finding the source material is big.
Right. And they can do that on the information overload ones because it's information overload. The point is, can you even find your way back to like what's the right sentence or a couple of pieces of information here? That's what they're really testing you on. So if you can map it really well and get back to the right grouping of information, the right sentence or two, you're in a much better spot to be able to essentially spit back to them whatever it is that they asked for. All right. I love it. Okay. Speaking of research project, anything you want to elaborate?
Yeah. I mean, this is huge. I will say too, with reading comprehension, there are many different question types we could talk about, but broadly speaking, there are general questions and there are specific questions. And so I know a lot of you guys are taking the test soon. I'm seeing some questions in chat about that. If I can give you some last minute advice for reading comprehension, when you read, you're trying to answer the general questions already, right? You're just trying to say, what is the big picture? And at some point you're going to get a question, what would the author most agree with? You already know the answer to that. You don't need to go reread. Then you're going to have maybe 2 questions that say, in line 24, what does this word mean? Or why did the author say this word or something like that? That's a specific question. They're asking you about a specific detail about the passage. You go back and you do your research. And by the way, the answer might not be on line 24. It might be the line before, or it might be the line after, so you might have to do a little bit of reading. That's the research, right? Why is this word there? Oh, well, let's go read the context. Let's find the answer. It's going to be somewhere in the passage. And so remember, they're not testing how clever you are or, what kind of crazy connections you can make. They're testing how good a researcher are you? How good are you at finding where that evidence is?
Oh, and I'm glad you brought that up, because one other thing just to note, there's a little bit of a difference in RC versus MSR, excuse me, in terms of big picture versus detail questions. So for reading comp, you're definitely going to have typically 2 or 3 big picture questions. It's usually 1 per passage. You might have a passage where you don't actually get a big picture question and you only get detailed questions. On the MSR side, they don't typically ask you big picture questions. They'll typically go straight to the detail. But even for that, still, you have to understand the big picture. There's like so much information and it's on different tabs that you really do have to understand the big picture of the story in order to navigate and be able to find your way to the details that are needed for each question. Anything else we should talk about on that?
I don't know. I think that covers it.
All right, that's it. We've got free starter kits. I'll do this part quickly. We've got free starter kits for GMAT and GRE on our website. Feel free to go take a look and sign up. There's no like There's no credit card required or anything. There's just free information there. And then I mentioned at the top some discount codes that are available just for today, some special discount codes. If you have any other questions for us, we've still got a couple minutes. Toss them in the chat. Let us know. And Ryan, should we scroll back up? Did we miss any questions in the chat?
I don't think so, but can I give a plug for that free starter kit? It's awesome. If you're at the beginning of your GMAT studies, it is like immediately a lot of information that will help you understand the test and how it's scored and just get you started on your study. So go check it out.
Right. I'm going to put that back up on the screen with a pretty graph, you know.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of this resource.
Thanks so much for coming, everybody. And we do have, this is the second part of a 3-part series. We do have the third part coming up where we're going to cover the math side of things, the quant and DI sections. So please join us for that.